Thank you. Kia ora tātou. Before I pass this segment over to the reporting officers, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone again who's been involved in the development of proposed Plan Change 9 and to all who have been involved in the hearings these past weeks. I'd like to acknowledge and recognise the significant time, effort and dedication they've afforded to the process. Over the last 3 weeks of hearings, we've heard from all sectors of our community, and as I said in my opening, the level of engagement we've had in this process indicates how important the issues surrounding fresh water are for the tank catchments, the region and Aotearoa. We were very fortunate to have our first week of hearings held at Mangaroa Marae, and again I would like to thank Caudry and his whānau for their manaakitanga. I would also like to thank and recognise Mangaroa Marae representatives who have actually attended every single day of the hearings. Our second week was held at Toitoi in Hastings, and I'd like to give special thanks to Mare Apatu for his opening and closing of our proceedings and keeping us safe through his strong karakia. And in this final week, I'd like to thank Chad Tariha for opening the proceedings and for closing the hearing later today at the Purapuaki. During the 3 weeks, we've had numerous submitters explain to us what proposed Plan Change 9 means to them, their why, their land, their culture and their economy. I think there has been sound agreement that water is critical to all and is our sustaining life force. It is therefore a very important decision that our independent hearing panel have to make for the future freshwater management for these 4 catchments, and I'm grateful for their substantial efforts in understanding this plan. Ngā mihi. As noted in my opening statement, the tank collaborative process commenced in 2012 and at that time was considered to be a bold and innovative approach to plan development. 30 plus people representing various sectors of the community took part in 42 meetings over 6 years. The tank group was made up of mana whenua, environmental organisations, territorial local authorities, Department of Conservation, the District Health Board and primary sector representatives. Most members of the group remained for the duration of the process. The terms of reference for the group made clear from the outset that the members were selected to reflect the broad interests in water management and to provide a cross-section of values, understanding and perspectives. Members of the group were in the main nominated by their sector or group to be their mandated representative, and where they did not have the mandate, they participated as individuals. The expectation was for all of the members of the tank group to convey ideas and perspectives from their wider networks, and equally to feed back the information from the group to their networks. During those 6 years, the group took the time to immerse themselves in the issues relating to land and fresh water, share values, and gain an understanding of the science that was presented to them. The collaborative process was highly participatory and iterative over this period. The aim of the group was to provide the Council, via the Regional Planning Committee, with consensus recommendations regarding objectives, policies and rules. Where consensus could not be reached, it was intended that the decision-making would fall to the Regional Planning Committee. As new information, ideas and science came to the fore, the plan evolved. The plan was very much a community plan, rather than just being the Council's plan. Much of the plan has come about as a consequence of testing ideas and solutions within the tank group. At the conclusion of the tank collaborative process, the plan was handed over to the Regional Planning Committee in August 2018. The Regional Planning Committee were tasked with making final decisions, in particular on those issues where consensus had not been reached. These included high flow allocation limits, flow enhancement of lowland streams, minimum flows and allocation limits for Ngaruroro and Tutaikuri rivers. Some issues were not completed by the tank group, including protection of source water for community supply, stormwater discharge and land use change provisions. The ownership of the plan and the decision-making was in essence passed from the tank group and the community they represented to the members of the Regional Planning Committee. It should be noted that the Regional Planning Committee is the first co-governance committee in New Zealand which is supported by legislation. The Hawke's Bay Regional Planning Committee Act 2015. The role of the Regional Planning Committee is to oversee the review and development of the Regional Policy Statement and regional plans for the Hawke's Bay region, as required under RMA. With an equal number of regional councillors and post-settlement governance entities, this committee is the co-governance group for the management of natural resources in Hawke's Bay. The establishment of the Regional Planning Committee midway through the tank collaborative process did not come without its own challenges for mana whenua. This was a significant change in the landscape around representation and mandate. As the Regional Planning Committee traversed the remaining issues, it was highlighted that the collaborative process did not meet the expectations of all mana whenua. It is acknowledged that through the evolution of the plan development, there has been significant pressures on mana whenua in terms of their ongoing time and commitment to remain in the process, and for that I am grateful. Their input has been invaluable and has significantly altered the way the plan has been formed. I would like to touch on one other part regarding the collaborative process. During the past 3 weeks, the panel has heard a range of views regarding the success or otherwise of this process, and I was asked by the panel during my opening statement, if you were to do it again, would you do it differently? I stand by my answer that yes, I would do things differently. However, that being said, I would also like to reiterate my earlier comments that the collaborative process was invaluable for a number of reasons, particularly the forming of relationships, and it has enabled people of all sectors of the community to come together to share their values and ideas. So if I was asked, did I think the collaborative process was a success, my answer to that would be yes. However, I acknowledge that as with all processes, there should be lessons learned, both positive and negative. And these lessons should influence how we do things in the future. Titiro whakamuri, kia haere whakamua. Reflect on where you have come to enable the path ahead. We acknowledge the drafting amendments requested by Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Incorporated and have considered the amendments being sought. We acknowledge that for mana whenua, the Māori voice may not appear as dominant in the proposed plan as they would have wanted, but the voice of mana whenua was heard strongly in the development of proposed Plan Change 9. The new limits and objectives for freshwater and its management were a key part of the iwi message. This is evidenced by the general acknowledgement by submitters and stakeholder groups that a change to the way land and water is managed is necessary, and the support for the outcomes for improved water quality and needs for limits on resource use. The final point I'd like to clarify is with regards to kotahi and how the tank plan fits into the development of this combined regional plan. As noted within my statement of reply evidence, the Regional Council is scheduled to undertake a review of the Regional Policy Statement, Regional Resource Management Plan and the Regional Coastal Environment Plan, and has taken the decision to combine these broader plan review work streams with the freshwater planning required under the MPSFM 2020. This has been part of a wider discussion with the Regional Planning Committee and Council in developing the long-term plan proposals for kotahi, in particular regarding additional resourcing required to actively involve tangata whenua in plan development. The Regional Council are required by the MPSFM to notify the freshwater plan by the 31st of December 2024. I acknowledge there have been a number of queries regarding the alignment of proposed Plan Change 9 with the MPSFM 2020, and in particular where the plan is not giving effect to the MPS, when this alignment will take place. It is proposed to revisit these areas of the plan which have not given effect to the MPSFM by December 2024. This review of the tank catchments will form part of the development of kotahi. This regional approach will enable the Council to develop the visions and values for all of the catchments in partnership with tangata whenua and give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. I'd like to now pass on to Mr. Conway. Did you want to pause for questions between speakers? I should have asked you that at the beginning.
Probably with Mr. Conway, I think it's useful for some discussion.
Yeah, we're thinking we'll continue, and again, to Mr. Conway's suggestions, we might just pause to see if we've got any questions. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Hopefully that's audible now, is it?
Thank you.
Great. Now you've got some written submissions there from me, which I'm happy to take you through. There are some chunks that I think I can step through quite quickly, and other parts that you may wish to hear more about, but I'll be guided by you, Mr Chair, as we go through as to what those might be.
Yeah, I've managed to have a quick flick through. I didn't quite get through right to the end, so I think that approach will be acceptable. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The first page really is there as just as a bit of a menu of what I'll cover, and I won't take you through that, but those are essentially the headings that follow throughout and that I've set through in sequence. The first topic is the timing and legal effect of the provisions. Now, there have been some questions raised through the hearing about when these provisions will take effect, when will they be able to actually start working. And somewhat helpfully, I hope, the RMA provides that the plan provisions or rules that protect or relate to water have legal effect immediately on notification as a proposed plan or change. Now, I'm conscious that the rules here are a mix of Section 14 rules, for example, and Section 9 rules, but my reading of them all is that they all protect or relate to water, and I understand the way the Regional Council has been approaching it is that all of the rules in this plan change had legal effect from the date of public notification.
So that includes rules made under 9.3 as well?
Yes, that's my reading of it. I've looked for commentary on the question of whether that is expressly covered. The wording in section, which one is it? 86B is protects or relates to. Now, the substance and effect of the rules that relate to land use for management of leaching, for example, is essentially to protect water. So my interpretation of that, and I accept it's my interpretation, but I've not seen any alternative commentary, is that those rules protect or relate to water and therefore had immediate legal effect.
So when the rules refer to the schedules, insofar as those schedules are reproduced there, do they also have some effect?
Yes, well, to the extent that the rules rely on the schedules to have meaning, then yes, the schedules are essentially part of the effect of the rules. When we step further through the process and get to the point of a decision, at that point the provisions, the rules as they are decided on at that point, they will have legal effect, and so any applications that are processed now will consider the proposed rules, and any applications that are made and processed after the decision is made by the panel will be considered under the decision-based rules. Likewise, because Section 104 requires regard to be had to the provisions of a plan or proposed plan, all of the objectives and policies in this proposed plan change would need to be considered under any consent application that's being considered now that relates to these activities, albeit that more weight gets placed on those provisions the further through the Schedule 1 process they proceed. Turning now to the implications of RMA reform, I can touch on this reasonably briefly, but it was raised earlier on in the hearing that we've got a new piece or pieces of legislation coming, and what does that mean for this whole process? In short,
the end is nigh, but we're carrying on.
That's right, that's it. The decisions are made under the current legislation. The future legislation will need to do its mahi at the time, and we can't really guess about exactly what that'll be, but I don't think there's any need to reflect on that in too great a detail.
Thank you.
Now, I take a few pages here to discuss scope issues, and I suspect it won't disappoint you to hear that there's not too much in this, I think, and I don't plan to take you through these submissions in detail, but I've been reflecting.
I don't mind you just taking your time through.
Yes.
These ones are quite important to us. So.
Yes, okay, I'm happy to do that. The first part of it relates to the question about whether a general submission point seeking that the proposed plan change give effect to the NPS FM 2020 provides scope for wide-ranging changes. And there is some discussion here on this. Part of the reason I think it may be useful to cut to the chase is because, particularly when it comes to Ngāti Kahanganu's submission, I think in the interest and the intrigue that the lawyers have had in focusing on the question of what scope those words give, it's also helpful to look back and see what specific changes that submission also sought. And in short, where I get to in this section is that it wasn't limited to relief seeking to give effect to the NPS. The Ngāti Kahungunu submission raised a range of points of relief, albeit without specific drafting at the time, that gave a reasonable understanding of what was being sought by the submitter. And so I think that potentially means that the question of how much scope you get merely by the words give effect to the NPS assumes a much lower degree of significance. So that's essentially the point I make in this section.
Would you also anticipate the changes will fairly reasonably give rise to them where the submitter has a particular interest? Do you think that's something that should influence that consideration? Like, for instance, with the submissions of forest and bird, you'd have an assumption and a good inclination of the types of submissions they're going to make, even if they're in a general sense, you'd imply that they would have a particular intention.
You might be able to read some of that into it, but really it is the original submission and it's the way it's expressed that provides that scope.
Thank you.
Yeah. So would you like me to take you through that whole section or really rest on that?
I'll just check with the other commissioners. Do you want to take it through? Yes, please.
Take you through it?
Yes.
Great. So 4.2 I've touched on really. 4.3, there is merit in my view from both a legal and practical perspective in what Mr Robinson for Low Corporation said, that a submission needs to have specified the changes it seeks to the plan rather than simply state at a high level that the plan needs to give effect to a particular NPS. And Ms Johnston for the Hawke's Bay wine growers appeared to have some sympathy for that point too. And I've set out there the established test for scope, which is whether changes fairly and reasonably fall within the submissions. And so one way that the court often considers that is by looking at whether other submitters would have anticipated the specific changes that might be sought based on that submission. And if they could anticipate those changes, then the submission fairly and reasonably gave rise to them. As Counsel for Ngāti Kahungunu and EDS noted, while most parties agree that the plan change should give effect to the NPS FM 2020, they differ on what this means. And so that highlights, in my view, the challenge that a member of the public would be faced with if all it saw was a submission point saying give effect to the NPS, because it could mean different things to different people. So the person reading that wouldn't necessarily know what the submitter themselves was meaning by that, and therefore what changes they had in mind. So then in 4.6, if all that a submission asked for was that, then I would say, and this may be where I differ from Mr Enright, I would say that that would fail the tests just as a submission saying give effect to Part 2 of the RMA would, because readers could not really know what was meant and what changes might follow. However, the relief sought in the Ngāti Kahungunu submission was not limited to that general point above and did state the changes to the plan change that it sought. While it did not contain the detailed amendments now sought through evidence, it raised a range of matters in relief sought, and I've just picked out 3 examples there, such as seeking a new tangata whenua objective and policy, a groundwater allocation of 70 million cubic metres per year, and the removal of flow maintenance policies and other provisions. So as a result, in my submission, an appropriate way to approach the matter would be to first consider the merits of the relief that is sought in evidence. In other words, identify whether the panel is satisfied that what is being sought in evidence as appropriate and is justified by the evidence. And then, in terms of any relief the panel was minded to accept, check back against the original submission to see if that was raised in name, if not in word. And it may be in my submission that very few, if any, actual scope limitations arise. I've noted then, in addition to the question of scope, there are matters of practicality that are raised if the details of the drafting changes sought by a submission are provided in evidence before the hearing rather than the submission itself. And this may well be the reason why there is some value in providing drafting changes as early as possible in the process. That it's simply a practical consequence that the Section 42A report writer and other submitters, when they're writing their evidence, if it's to be filed at the same time, just don't have that wording in front of them, so they don't have the chance to respond to the detail in that way. In any event, and the officers I think will confirm this, in terms of the relief sought in the original Ngāti Kahanu submission, that was considered when preparing the Section 42A report, and then they have subsequently considered the relief that sought specific drafting in Ms Wilson's evidence. And so I know that was a point that was discussed earlier on in the hearing, and they touch on it in their response today.
Thank you.
So just on that, counsel for EDS, I think, highlighted Section 55 of the Act, which is, I think it was some provision in Section 55 that said we have to give effect to the the MPS as soon as reasonably practicable. What weight would you give that particular point? Or is it limited by the provisions in the MPS to require the council to go through an extensive process before they do a lot of this?
I think it's both. Essentially, as soon as reasonably practicable does rely on those process steps that the NPS requires, and so there are some of the components and the thrust of the NPS that you can and should seek to build in as much as you can to this plan change. But there are some of those components, the steps requiring consultation, the FMUs, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the NOF process, those things envisage a particular process, and so those are happening and will happen as soon as reasonably practicable, and that's hopefully provides some comfort that that will happen rather than necessarily needing to be shoehorned in through this particular process.
Thank you.
And I suppose the other point is, even if no submission had said give effect to the NPS, you'd have to try and do it anyway. That's simply the effect of the provision you referred to, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Turning now to the beef and lamb submission, as is often the case after writing what I've written here, I've thought of a much simpler way to express it. So if I take you to that first, and then you can decide whether you want to hear my more long-winded way. In essence, as I read it, the changes that beef and lamb sought to Schedule 30 through evidence and through their presentation to the hearing are primarily focused on the addition of a council approval process for freshwater farm plans. So that's the blue tracking I saw in Schedule 30 that they provided when they submitted, as well as some refinements to the provisions about catchment collective freshwater plans. So that's what they're seeking now. Looking back at the beef and lamb submission, I think there is a logical connection to what was raised in that submission. For a start, there is an express reference to Schedule 30, and in particular to a request for a more for facilitating landowner preparation of these plans, particularly the farm plans. And in essence, the relief that's sought around providing a more detailed approval process by the council, I think, sits alongside that in terms of providing a way for the council to look over those plans in a more specific way. And so, in essence, I don't think there is a meaningful scope limitation on your ability to consider that relief that's being sought. So that's my shorthand way of saying it.
Thank you, that was probably sufficient for me. Yep. Any nods? Yep, we'll carry on.
Turning to the Hawke NZ submission, I think helpfully and responsibly, Hawke NZ's counsel raised this as a proactive step in legal submissions, which has been helpful, and looked to provide a proactive way of explaining why they believe the changes to objectives 10 to 14 and 16 are within the scope of the original submission. And I think, as was pointed out at the time, there is no reference to those specific objectives in Hawke NZ's original submission. And so I say there that it did refer to consequential amendments arising from the specific changes sought, and it did say they may affect the entire plan. And so there was a signal in the initial submission that there may be other changes, and that's not an uncommon thing at all. An express reference to a particular provision is not necessarily required in a submission in order to allow scope for those changes to be made to that provision in reliance on the submission. However, in the absence of an express reference, submission would still need to have raised the subject matter in a manner that made it possible for a submitter or another submitter to understand the changes were a potential consequence of accepting the submission. And so then we turn to looking at what Hawke NZ's submission said. It mentioned food security in a broad manner, and also dealt with the importance of Hawke's Bay food production for domestic supply. And so there appears to be a broad link between the original amendments sought to Policy 21 along those lines, particularly in terms of domestic food supply, and the amendments now requested to Objectives 10 to 14 and 16. And so I suppose one difference is that the submission sought changes reflecting food supply matters, and what's now being sought is wording about food security. You might debate whether those two things are equivalent or have both been fairly raised, but the submission itself did refer to both food supply and food security. And so while it's not necessarily clear that the changes to Objectives 10 to 14 and 16 are consequential to the relief sought in relation to Policy 21, including because the wording differs slightly. The words food security were mentioned in the submission, and so I think it's fair to say it's not a strong signal that these changes might follow, but the subject matter of the submission point was raised in the submission. And so I think there is a pathway there to make some changes along those lines. But what I would note just at the end there is that the officers, I think this is still the case, have not recommended any amendments to the objectives to refer to food supply. In part this is because the objectives already seek to enable primary production water needs and water required for associated processing, etc. So there is a more general flag of those points in those objectives.
That's an interesting point, because certainly my reading of their submission, the way in which it was written and set out, the format it used was quite specific to the policies, and it was quite obvious and was very quick to realise that those matters hadn't been raised in their submission because of the format it used. So they're clearly not submitted on those particular policies, but had specifically submitted on the others. So that was the question, where the question derived from. That does 4.21 does seem like what do I say? That's sitting on the fence, but
that's more about your judgment will need to be about the merits naturally,
yes.
As well as scope. But that was provide a little bit of context about for your consideration of the merits.
Okay, thank you.
Turning to stock drinking water takes and root stock protection. The drinking water takes point has been raised a few times during the hearing, and in particular concern was raised that rules 7 and 8 restrict stock drinking water takes, which are normally permitted by section 14.3b of the RMA. What those rules provide for is new stock drinking water takes of up to 5 cubic metres per day, and for the continuation of existing lawful stock drinking water takes subject to conditions primarily relating to particular bodies or sources of water, other takes, and preventing changes to levels and flows to wetland streams or rivers. So those are words taken from the permitted activity rules. The Council recognises the importance of providing drinking water for stock. However, as submitters correctly noted, section 14.3b takes are not unlimited. They are only permitted by the Act if the take does not or is not likely to have an adverse effect on the environment. Those words are clear from section 14.3b as well. And it's also been confirmed by the Environment Court in the Hawke case. And those words that I've quoted there have been quoted in other legal submissions you've received during the hearing. Submitters indicated that they consider those rules restrict the section 14.3b takes further than the existing limits in the RMA and case law. And it's nice when you're not first. This issue was considered almost exactly in that Hawke case. And what the court said there was that the Waikato Regional Council's rules about those takes were simply defining the already existing limits. The court held the rules indicated when adverse effects would occur, and therefore they did not restrict the ability to take or use water under section 14.3b any more than the existing limits. And it further noted that this was helpful for users of those takes because it provided clear limits on when adverse effects would occur. And essentially that's what these rules in this particular plan change seek to do as well, by defining or taking into account the existing pressures on water body resources and the desire to reduce effects on them. And so in my submission this is clearly aimed at defining when adverse effects do or are likely to occur.
Carry on.
Great. In terms of root stock protection, the officers I think talk about this a little bit later on today, but there was a request by submitters for confirmation that water could be taken as a permitted activity for root stock protection. Unlike stock drinking water, there is no specific RMA protection for root stock. So it's a planning judgment essentially as to whether such a permitted activity is appropriate. And you've heard evidence and you've had discussion there about rules 7 and 8 and the allowance that those rules make for taking in use of up to 20 cubic metres of water per property per day, where that take was permitted and existed as at 2 May 2020. Now I turn to probably the longer list of points and questions that I'll step through, which is the ones that relate to the NPS FM 2020. And as I note here seems to be general agreement that the NPS FM 2020 needs to be implemented to the extent possible within the scope of submissions. And really it's about what that looks like and how much it helps the various groups and types of takes. And there I've just repeated the same headings that you saw on the first page of my submissions, which I'll step through now.
Thank you. So from 6.2?
Yes. So yeah, 6.2 just sets out that hierarchy in Te Mana o Te Wai. Again, the 3 tiers, which I won't read out. And I think part of what I'm hoping is helpful is some sort of indication about what each of those limbs might include. And so in terms of the first and third tiers, I'll cover those quite shortly and then focus on the second. So in terms of the first tier, the court has stated in the Northland Regional Plan decision earlier this year that the NPSF 2020 objective gives primacy to ecological values, while also noting that the 2014 NPS also did that as well. And I think in terms of what limited judicial guidance we have so far, that does appear to be a clear steer that the Tier 1 hierarchy is about ecological values rather than wider matters. So at this point, that's as much as I've seen the court say about that, certainly in terms of the latest NPS. And then the third tier appears to be a wide catch-all for uses not captured by the first two. So if that's seen as capturing everything else, then the question is really what comes under tier 2 and who can get a slight leg up on the catch-all. And so issues raised during the hearing in 6.4 included whether water for growing crops falls within tier 2 because providing healthy food supports people's health needs, and if so, whether that will be limited to food supply to this region or New Zealand or beyond. And the next point I think is, I think it's important. I think a comprehensive determination of what falls within tier 2 is arguably not necessary to start with within this particular plan change context. And probably more importantly, it may be preemptive, given that there hasn't yet been the consultation that is needed in this region, throughout this region, to determine how Te Mana o Te Wai applies, and particularly how that hierarchy applies in this region. And I think that is an important step, so that the community has a chance to have input into that, and that there are some determinations made on a more comprehensive basis about how this applies.
So you're thinking specifically to 3.2, Te Mana o Te Wai, every regional council must engage with communities with tangi whenua to determine how Te Mana o Te Wai applies to water bodies and freshwater ecosystems in the region.
Yes, that's right. And so the other thing that I suppose that leads to is in this process, some submitters have raised it and some haven't. And it may be that the ones who haven't, or others who weren't even involved in this process, might have said, oh, I've got something to say about that, if I'd realised we were going to be talking about this NPS when I'd made my submission. So there is some caution needed, I just think, about how far you go down the track of saying, oh, well, this would be in and this would be out. That's essentially what I'm saying there. And so what I've done in the following sections is really to just summarise what guidance is currently available, in the hope that it generally informs your consideration rather than inviting you to specifically determine how far you need to go on this front, or necessarily even making a finding on whether the particular uses that have been referred to you in the hearing would fall within tier 2 or not. You may find that the general guidance and principles are sufficient without making a determinative finding on that.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
So, turning to what the Ministry itself has said about the NPSFM, it describes on its website tier 2 as relating to the essential needs of people, and that wording essential was in the earlier draft NPSFM, and it's also in the discussion document that informed it. So although the word essential has dropped out of it when the final version has come along, the inclusion of the words such as drinking water and its legislative history indicate that tier 2 is primarily concerned with essential health needs, and that may find some support from section 5.2a in terms of life supporting capacity of water. But again, I don't think that's something we need to be definitive on at this point. The appendix in the NPSFM about those two particular growing areas that are listed did come up in the hearing, and I think Councillor Alfa-Hordenzi said, well, I've tried not to place too much reliance on that because they don't apply here. But I suppose by way of a very broad analogy, if we think about how the NPSFM itself might be applying the hierarchy in those two growing areas, what it does is it requires the relevant regional council to have regard to, so it's no stronger than that, it's have regard to the importance of the contribution of those two growing areas to domestic supply of fresh vegetables and maintaining food security for New Zealanders. What the NPSFM does not do is draw a strong link or a clear or even direct link between that provision and tier 2. So it doesn't say this is because those are tier 2 issues. So I'm very cautious in saying, well, it must be there appears to be some logic, but I'm not going to put it any stronger than that.
I'm just having a deja vu moment of discussion in regards to that particular correlation or not, and how you might further populate that particular appendix, which is not helpful for the discussion in front of us right now.
Yes.
Yes.
So, again, it's only by way of analogy. If any other food growing areas were to be treated as being within Tier 2, you could probably surmise that the focus should be on the growing of vegetables for domestic supply on a fresh basis, along with food security for New Zealanders, which may be broader than fresh produce, but in context would still appear to be limited to vegetables. So, again, context only. So then applying that analysis to the extent we can to Horticulture New Zealand's submission points about water for growing crops, while food is essential for human health, it does not necessarily follow that all food growing fits within Tier 2 of the hierarchy. So a focus on vegetables for domestic supply could potentially be appropriate, but there does not appear to be any clear basis to define Tier 2 to include healthy food, whatever that might be, and such an approach would likely lead to challenges of interpretation as well as uncertainty about the breadth of that category and whether it would allow for meaningful prioritisation. So, turning now, subject to any questions, to the question of really what does prioritisation mean within that hierarchy itself. This relates to that question I've set out there in 6.10 about whether the hierarchy of obligations requires complete compliance with the first tier of Te Mana o Te Wai at the expense of the second or third, or should you in all cases be looking to provide for all three tiers? Again, we're looking at fact sheets here from the Ministry, which is not quite at the level of judicial guidance, but gives you some idea about what might have been intended. And the fact sheet on Te Mana o Te Wai notes that ensures the health and well-being of the water is protected and human health needs are provided for before enabling other uses of water, which reiterates that both Tier 1 and 2 take priority over Tier 3. And as noted earlier, the Environment Court earlier this year has confirmed that the NPS gives primacy to ecological values, i.e. Tier 1. An important acknowledgement then follows in that fact sheet, which says the hierarchy does not mean, however, that in every case the water needs to be restored to a pristine or pre-human contact state before the other needs in the hierarchy can be addressed. And pausing there really to again emphasise the importance of that in this particular region. The catchments we're talking about are quite developed. So there's been a lot of industry and growing and use of a range of natures that have built up over time in reliance on water being available. And that is our current real world context that we've got to apply this in. And so I think what that fact sheet acknowledges is that it should not be the purpose of a plan that is giving effect to the NPSFM and the hierarchy to cut back water use to such an extent that it's back to the pre-human habitation levels and therefore gets, even just thinking about some of the lowland streams, what would it take? And Mr. Rakowski is going to talk a little bit about that when he presents later, but it's just a point of some caution that our target is not pre-human. Our target is to try and somehow prioritise within the context of the existing environment, and that's a challenging prospect that underpins the very challenge that we've had through the whole hearing. So just noting there that there is intended to be a prioritisation, but giving primacy to Tier 1 to the exclusion of the other tiers could significantly undermine the region's economy, and that is a relevant thing for consideration, which is part of the reason the questions you're being presented with are so difficult. However, I go on then to say it's not necessarily the case that water will always be available for both Tier 2 and Tier 3 in the volumes and at the times that water users would prefer. occur. And there may be some situations, such as drought periods, when minimum flows kick in, or seasons, which might be tied up with those same minimum flows, or even locations where the only way to meaningfully give Tier 1 primacy would be to restrict the water available for the other tiers. So that's why it needs to be dealt with carefully on a case-by-case basis, and to provide limits that are meaningful but try to grapple with that balance. And I think that leads reasonably naturally to the question of whether the goals in this plan change are ambitious and reasonable. And those words arise because of the discussion of long-term visions in the NPSFM. Those long-term visions which are to be set as part of kotahi, they must include goals that are ambitious and reasonable, with similarly ambitious and reasonable timeframes.
Difficult to achieve but not impossible.
I love that phrase.
It's somewhere around improbable. Or...
That's right.
Okay.
My 10-year-old's trying to find his socks. It's not impossible.
It's a good analogy.
So that clause requires community engagement to shape these long-term visions. And so while the preparation of this plan change did involve significant engagement, including through the collaborative process, that engagement predated the NPSFM 2020 and therefore was not in the context of developing those long-term visions. So that's part of the reason, as we've already said, that further process is necessary and is happening. But in the meantime, the plan change has endeavoured to set goals and timeframes that are both ambitious and reasonable. And the crux of it all, really, I think, is perhaps whether the balance has been struck right. And that's what we have been hearing through the submissions in the last 3 weeks. So some submitters have sought more ambition of both outcomes and timeframes, and some have sought more flexibility. The next point here is whether FMUs could be included in the plan change through decisions on submissions. And I've mentioned beef and lamb, but there are others who've raised that point. Beef and lamb looked at it perhaps in the context of the existing freshwater quality management units or tank areas, and wondered whether those could be reclassified as FMUs. The FMU process, I suppose, again, to take it back to what the process in the NPSFM requires, it's part of the National Objectives Framework process, which is quite a sequential process as set out in clause 3.7, or summarised in it, of the NPSFM. And then I've listed there the things that relate specifically to the FMUs that you've got to go through and do. And naturally that is on a region-wide basis, so that's part of the reason the process is being gone through on a region-wide basis. And then you've got to identify, as well as the FMUs, the monitoring sites. There's a consultation about those, particularly in relation to monitoring Māori freshwater values. And then you've got to identify primary contact sites, threatened habitats and outstanding water bodies and the like. And so councils must ensure that those monitoring sites are representative of the FMU and or representative of a primary contact site in the FMU, and the values have got to be identified and environmental outcomes for each value. And so while it's correct that submissions seek the inclusion of FMUs, it's not apparent to me, the panel may have a different idea, but it's not apparent to me at least that the panel has sufficient evidence at this point to complete that FMU identification process envisaged by the NPSFM within this plan change process, or that it would be able to do so in the comprehensive manner envisaged by the NPSFM. So that's separate to the question of scope, because people have asked for it. It's not a question of scope of submissions, it's a question of, is there a practical barrier here to you going through and doing that? And I think, to my mind, there is one. But with all of that in mind, you have heard, and you will hear more, I think, on the FMU process that's underway at the moment. The Regional Planning Committee, which Ms Emmons talked about earlier this afternoon, is going to be talking about that again shortly, and we'll be seeking to identify FMUs to consult on and then include them in the Kotahi plan. And so that will enable the Council to carry out the steps required by the NPS FM and address them throughout the region, ensuring a consistent approach is taken to their identification and implementation. And I think Beef and Lamb said, well, you might want to do it through a different process. And I think essentially that's what my submission is, that that's an appropriate alternative in this particular situation. The next point I'm going to discuss is the question about what Policy 11 of the NPSFM requires. Is there flexibility? Is it sequential? And the like. And this came up in submissions for Mr Apple, and others have mentioned the same sort of point. The suggestion was made that Policy 11 is sequential, and the requirement to avoid future over-allocation only occurs once existing over-allocation is phased out. And I've quoted the policy there. I haven't seen any guidance yet about what Policy 11 means to clarify whether that sort of interpretation is correct. But there is a small amount of guidance on Objective B2 of the former NPSFM, and I probably should say the 2014 amended in 2017, to be strictly correct. And that was using the same sort of words but flipped around the other way. The guidance on that objective described two kinds of over-allocation, recognised and consented. So recognised over-allocation is where over-allocation of freshwater bodies prevents them delivering desired community outcomes or fails to safeguard life-supporting capacity. And then consented over-allocation occurs where unacceptable changes are not occurring but would if all the consented allocations were fully exercised. And so when we've been talking about 180 million cubic metres versus say 90, there's consented amounts that we've been wrestling with in this hearing. Whichever type of over-allocation is considered, I've looked at it from a few different ways, and I can't quite see how a sequential reading of the policy would lead to a materially different outcome from seeing those two parts of it applying at the same time. And the reason I say that is because a decision to allocate new water, if I can call it that, while there is existing over-allocation, would appear to be contrary to the requirement to phase out over-allocation, whether or not the words about avoiding future over-allocation are treated as being applicable to such a decision. So even if you say it's sequential and avoiding future over-allocation is not even part of the picture yet, by increasing allocation, it's hard to see how that's phasing out existing over-allocation. So that's the simple point there. So, to put another way, focusing on phasing out a consented over-allocation while continuing to grant consents that would create over-allocation would undermine the implementation of that policy. And so I think adopting a proposed approach and a practical analysis informed by that earlier guidance, a sequential reading of the requirements would not achieve the policy's overall purpose. However, and this comes back to the first point that was made in those submissions for Mr Apple about the point, there is flexibility about the timing of implementation, and so I think that's probably the more important point. It's not the case that Policy 11 says, it's all got to cut back to a non-over-allocated state immediately. There is a process of phasing it out, and I think that's what those words quite clearly mean, and that in turn links to the reference to goals and timeframes that are both ambitious and reasonable. We have heard from some submitters that the plan change should be substantially amended to give effect to the NPSFM or withdrawn or declined on the basis that it does not give effect to the NPSFM. I think the question of withdrawal of the plan change is something that sits with the council rather than the panel, but in any event, you do have the power to decide whether to reject the plan change, therefore declining it. So that's in the frame if you thought it was appropriate. And as we've heard, including today, a number of submitters have noted that such a decision to approve Plan Change 9 would be a step towards giving effect to the NPSFM 2020 and would therefore better give effect to that NPS than a decision to decline it would. And that's the Council's position too. Declining the plan change would fail to give effect to the NPSFM at all and would delay its implementation. And so this is where we return back to the discussion earlier about legal effect. A decision to approve it with whatever amendments the panel considers need to be made would enable the amended provisions to be applied to consent processes that are underway or soon to be, and therefore provide that updated framework rather than needing to wait another 3 years for the Kotahi plan review. I've next addressed the question of municipal takes and giving effect to potentially competing national policy statements. Legal submissions heard this morning have queried whether the Council's approach has made a policy choice to implement the freshwater policy statement over the urban development policy statement. It has not made such a policy choice, but the matters raised by the TAs rightly highlight the challenges with giving effect to both national policy statements. As noted in the Office's Section 42 Addendum report, all three councils have obligations under both national policy statements and will need to ensure that growth is able to be serviced while aligning with them both. The way in which this plan change seeks to do so is set out most recently in the 11 June shopping list document provided by the officers. In recognition of both the NPSUD and the prioritisation of drinking water under the NPSFM, the plan change enables municipal suppliers, can strike out can, it should say to, maintain their current allocated volumes rather than being limited to action and reasonable past use. It prioritises users for human health. It provides for a 30-year consent duration for municipal uses rather than the 15-year duration for other users. It enables and favours transfers towards communities' health needs from other users. It provides opportunities for augmentation and storage to meet environmental requirements and future demand. So that's all set out in more detail in that shopping list document and with reference to all the particular policies. And so the point here is really it wouldn't be accurate to say this plan change doesn't give a particular nod to municipal takes for drinking water, because it does so in a range of ways. Which leads us back to this key remaining question, which I then touch on, which is whether municipal take should still be subject to the interim allocation limit. And that's, I suspect that's probably the big question, as well as the drafting questions that come into it, and that's around the things like the activity status for expansions of those municipal takes. In light of the policy directive to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai and phase out over allocation, in my submission, the approach that the officers have taken is a valid and available policy decision. In practice, this may mean that if water above the allocation limit is not available when territorial authorities approach their existing consent limits, solutions for future water supply may need to lie in further efficiency measures, other sources, or in storage. And the other component is the question about transfers from other types of uses. So there are some pathways. They may not be easy pathways, but are present. Turning now to...
So just before you leave that,
yes.
have you got a copy of the NPS with you?
Which one?
Freshwater.
Freshwater, yes.
So if I look at section 3.2, which talks about Te Mana o Te Whai, it says every regional council must engage with communities, every council must give effect, and in doing so, C says apply the hierarchy of obligations as set out in clause 135, which is the objective. Why does the objective take priority over those other matters in terms of every regional council must give effect to?
Why does the objective do that? So is it your question?
If you go back to the objective,
Yeah.
which is 1.3.5,
Which is about prioritising in those three tiers.
it says fundamental concept, and then there is a hierarchy of obligations that prioritises. So you would read that in that context of 1.3 rather than the other in 3.2. Have I got that right?
3.2, let me just have a look. It essentially states it twice, I think. If you, to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, you look at those earlier provisions to say what it means.
Yes.
And then it's also repeated in the hierarchy of obligations in 3.2, so it's, you'd probably say it's stated twice, at least twice, in that process. I'm not sure if that answers the question you've got, but it's heavily present.
I'm probably not sure of the question I've got. The other thing this morning was there was a suggestion in an Environment Court decision that if we couldn't reconcile these two policy statements, and it seemed to be a throwaway statement, that we should have recourse to Part 2. Do you have any comment on that?
I think the starting point is, can you read them in a way that's consistent? And I think part of the issue we're grappling with is that under the NPSUD, you've got to provide for growth and servicing growth. And under the NPSFM, there is a pretty significant prioritisation, including of ecological matters that may stand in the way of prioritising provision of water for that growth. The fact that Tier 2 includes drinking water means that there is some level of prioritisation, I think, in the NPSFM, which provides a way to read them together, so that as opposed to takes that are not drinking water takes, there is a bit of a leg up and a way to try and find a pathway. What all of this assumes is that there is water to be allocated, and so in some ways what we're seeing here is a clash between the NPSUD and the environment and the water available, rather than just a clash between that and the NPSFM. But yes, returning to Part 2 is available in terms of any clash between them, but your first step is to look at whether you can read them in a way that's consistent. And I think that's probably just about enough to get you a pathway through here.
Across the line. Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you.
Home stretch, last point, really is around this interim allocation limit and actual and reasonable use. And what I say there in 7.2, and the reason I'm reasonably brief on this point, is essentially this is a policy and planning question rather than just a legal one, but the key issues, or three key issues I think that the panel will be grappling with are: one, whether the interim allocation limit's justified; two, whether the provisions strike an appropriate balance in allocating water within the limit; and three, whether more flexibility within the provisions is appropriate. And then consideration of those key issues needs to occur obviously in the context of the objective and policies of the NPSFM 2020 and the NPSUD. Obviously I haven't noted it there, but it sits there. And the requirements of section 32 and 32AA, and based on the evidence before the panel. Really the last point that I cover here is a bit about flexibility and the question of existing investments. And it's been evident throughout that there are a range of submitters who have got an allocation of water on paper. They're not currently using it, but they've made some investments or plans towards utilising it in future. And the question has been raised, well, how do we take that into account? And so when looking at what the RMA says about this, naturally when you go through a resource consent process that's affected by section 124, which is about reconsenting, the council is required to have regard to the existing investment, or the investment that an existing consent holder has already made. And so the officers have been looking at that and will be presenting some suggestions in terms of the provisions, particularly around the way policy 37 applies, that seek to ensure that the council, the consent authority in that role, is not prevented from meaningfully taking into account existing investment when it is processing consent applications. And so I anticipate that's going to be a useful thing for you to reflect on in terms of whether that strikes an appropriate balance. And so that's probably all I'll say about that point at this stage, but really that it's an understandable point that submitters have made, and the question is how you balance that need to consider those matters against the question of what the interim allocation limit should be and how much flex that gives and what the impact of that on the environment might be. And then finally, in terms of consideration of the efficiency and effectiveness of the provisions, Council recognises that any reductions in allocation will have economic and social impacts that need to be balanced against social, cultural and environmental impacts of the present level of allocation. And it's sought to strike an efficient, effective and fair balance that aligns with the hierarchy established in the NPS by prioritising the health and well-being of the catchment area by reducing the current level of consented allocation, recognising the health needs of people by providing a targeted approach to takes for drinking water, and recognising that allocation should support the community's wider social and economic needs by being based on action on reasonable use.
Thank you. We'll see if we've got any further questions. Doesn't look like we've got any further questions. Thank you, Mr. Floyd. Much appreciated. We're at 3:20. We might have a 5-minute stretch. Thank you.